The sponsor of Liftoff with Keith is the one and only CompassStrategicAdvisors.com, an experienced partner to help you navigate everything from cap tables to stock option and compensation plans and all types of backroom and marketing services. There is no better friend to the startup CEO than Compass. Check them out at CompassStrategicAdvisors.com. Okay, let's get started. Liftoff. And that's what we're about to do. I mean, look, 1,000 of startups are building AI products. Very few are building AI systems that enterprise actually trust. There's a massive difference between a compelling demo and a production-ready company. Good thing for you guys today listening. My guest today, Greg Whalen, has spent decades operating at the intersection of AI, infrastructure, payments, enterprise systems, large-scale engineering, and more. From AWS, a little company you may have heard of, to Zendit, maybe a smaller company. I don't know, about the same maybe. To now the CTO of Prove AI. Greg's seen what happens when emerging technology collides with real world complexity. So today we're going to talk about what founders are getting right, what they're dangerously underestimating, and why the future of AI may depend less on intelligence and more on proof. This is Liftoff, and I want to welcome Greg Whalen to the show. Greg, what's shaking in Boston today?
Yeah. Thank you so much for the intro. Great to be here. Nice warm day here in the Boston area. Look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, man, when it gets warm and you're walking around the Charles River and waving to all those folks at Harvard Square, I mean, that's a tough visual to beat. But yes, Greg, let's get into it a little bit. I'm so anxious to talk to you. I really appreciate you taking the time. You really have worked across all areas. What patterns repeat across every major technology wave that you've been part of?
Yeah. So, I think that some of the patterns here that I like to focus on, I'm particularly interested in solving and helping with, at least in AI, is the fact that AI making AI portable, provable, and easy to debug, right? Easy to deploy and run at scale has been something that's been keeping me up and has been a constant shoulder pain, for the last several decades, right? So one of the reasons I joined up with Prove AI was just as AI explodes into more flavors than there were, before, as it becomes even more critical, right, in for any business and any technologist. I was sort of getting the hope that a lot of these problems around, how do we share and how do we collaborate on AI? How do we debug and troubleshoot AI, right, in an efficient way? So obviously, it's not like we can't do that, but doing it at scale, doing it efficiently, doing it without a bunch of unexpected outcomes, I think is something that's always been ripe for solving. Yeah, it's just as we look into some of the problems out there, I mean, these are things that I think are repeating themselves, right? There's a new technology wave out there. People are suddenly becoming immensely interested in one particular type of AI, generative AI, agentic AI. And I just look at this, and every time this type of thing happens, right? The move from the need to have a specialist to debug, to look into all of those things, and treating that as okay typically goes away, right? It typically becomes something that now everybody has to do, and
Right.
everybody has to do at scale, even if they don't necessarily want to put in the time, right, or the thought to really figure out how to do this, right? And that's what really excites me here, because right, that's when things are ripe for the tool sets to suddenly start exploding, for really the infrastructure and the tooling to become mainstream enough for everybody to do this.
Are you seeing that founders are underestimating just how hard production systems really are?
Absolutely. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, yes, they're absolutely underestimating the amount of work that goes in, but they're also underestimating the differences in approach that are required. That you can't run it like a typical technology product. You can't stay hands off on it. I mean, there's a lot of pitfalls to generative AI that people are, stepping right into. So there are some similarities to past waves, but there's also some new ones, right? So, the fact that generative AI is relatively easy to understand from an external perspective. Like, so if you go back to like, the CI/CD wave, right? And that whole thing, that's less flashy, right? It's less something that somebody says, "Hey, cool, I want to get in on that." Generative AI, like everybody, I think that resonates with them, right? And it's something that they want to be a part of, right? So the more people coming to the table, more people, wanting to play around with it, which is great, right? But on the flip side, right, it also means that the unprecedented number of people talking about it, experimenting with it, causes a whole host of problems that do not look similar to some of the big technology waves that we've had in the past.
Then what separates the interesting AI projects from the real businesses?
Hmm. So you mean separates the
Those
uh,
those companies that you're working with that are addressing the problem versus more standard businesses.
oh, yes, absolutely. So I think that the ones that are doing it right are the ones who are really going deeply, right? And really just, clearing the table and saying, let's think about this from first principles. Like let's build up from nothing.
Right.
Let's figure out what we have to get great at, right? So I think that those are the two sort of fundamental things that I advocate internally, right? Is one is start with a blank slate, right? Don't Yes, there's baggage. Everybody has baggage. Put it aside, right? Should not be any dependencies. There's not ways you have to do. There's not governance things to worry about. Just, clear the table and just say, all right, where do you want to get? Like, where do you want to get, with your application? And now let's try to get there, right? Let's put aside all of these other concerns that we don't have answers to. Focus on the build, right? Focus on getting something out there, and feel free to just rethink everything, rethink how you're going to deliver this because really it shouldn't look anything similar like you've done in the past. So, right, that's one sort of caveat. That's one characteristic of successful companies out there, right? The other one, though, is to get super specific about what you do need to be good at. So the ones that are really specific about the problem they're solving and the technology, the domain they need to get familiar with in generative AI are the ones that tend to do better. Um, it's like, yeah, this matches up with a lot of my experience as well in highly complicated areas. Um, Being a generalist and saying, yeah, I kind of understand the AI trends, cool, I'm going to lead this is not the best approach, right? It should be, yeah, ignore 90% of what's going on out there if it's not useful to you.
Yeah.
Focus on getting
Are-
great at one or two things and do that, right? That's what you should be going for.
Do you think technical founders have it in a way where they kind of get confused between capabilities and product market fit?
Yeah, absolutely. So they'll confuse a bunch of things here, right? So and the root cause of it is really not thinking through like what specific problem do I have to solve? Put everything aside, who is my customer? Who is my user? What do they want, right? And that's one thing that Prove AI has we found difficult as well is that talking to potential customers, right? So if you are trying to get to product market fit, you shouldn't make the same assumptions about your customers or your potential users that you would have maybe 5 years ago, right? 5 years ago, I think you'd expect users to have a pretty linear progression in their own maturity, in their own needs, relatively stable population, relatively sensible. What we're seeing now, and we see people, with demands for AI, right? Start something, get into it for 2 months, and then throw it all away, right? Start over.
Right.
And that's largely a function because there's so many external dependencies that are changing quickly, e.g., foundation models,
Yeah.
moving in step. And what it means for product market fit, though, is that the age-old way of doing things, where you talk to customers, you do it for a couple of weeks, maybe a month, you get feedback, you think critically about what the shoulder pain or the problem is, you figure out what the solution is, and then you start to build. It doesn't work very well anymore in this environment. You're going to find a month into the process that your customer sentiment has changed entirely, right? And it's not, hey, there's a little tweak. It's, oh no, we gave up on that and we did something else. And it's very hard to work with.
Excuse me, you're describing something that I've heard described as the demo culture versus production reality.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yep.
mean, most companies are still in that experimental mode, but this is also a time where you can make some money. So you said Gen AI systems never make it from pilot to production. Why is that?
Yeah, so a lot of reasons. There's a whole host of reasons out there, but I think if we root cause it and do like a five whys exercise, I think what you'll come down to, right, is figuring out that the ultimately, right, it's that people have failed to evolve and to pivot quickly enough, right, in response to things. So they let it go too wrong and too long,
Yeah.
and they let it go down a path that was pretty clearly not the best path, but was the way to get it to release.
Yeah.
And it turned out though, and you say, well, it's probably going to be good enough. We just need another month. But the problem is you find out in another month that now it's not good enough anymore. It's not even releasable, right? It's not something we feel comfortable releasing with. So the root cause here, I think, is mostly you just go back to that, people are still taking too long to develop their prototypes, and then they're still too attached to them, right? And this is, I think, a symptom of how people have typically approached software, right? It's like um, you'll you identify the pain. Yes, it's going to take a few iterations. No, we're not afraid to fail. We're okay to fail for some things here, but the iteration cycle, I think, is moving really quickly, and customer sentiment is moving much more quickly, so that, right, you have to move some of that decision making down to individuals. You have to, split up teams so teams are smaller. You have to empower people. You have to put in different types of guardrails and mechanisms, right, to encourage people to throw away stuff, right? To say, hey, last week this was fine. 2 weeks later, we just got some feedback. We're hurtling down towards a dead end, and we can all see it. I just, what's happening is people don't speak up. They're like, well, we'll get the pilot out the door. And the silent thing in the room, the elephant in the room is, yeah, we're hurtling towards a dead end, right? This is, yes, it's going to work. It's a dead end. We're going to have to throw away 3/4 of it, but we're just collectively a little afraid to bring this up. And we'd like to at least see it get to into some user hands, because we figure some feedback is better than none. And that's what's fundamentally not true anymore, right? You should have gotten the feedback earlier, in order to avoid going down that dead end, because it just too many people get bought into it. They think, oh, well, we're 90% done. Surely a few course corrections at the end is fine. And what nobody's expecting is, yeah, but really it wasn't 90% done. It was 30% done. It just looked done, because AI
Mm.
is very different than traditional software, right? You get a result when you're
You're
30%
kind
done.
of you're kind of describing this new era of enterprise readiness, it feels like.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Enterprise readiness and how you govern AI and how you consume
Yeah.
prototypes and expectations around what you're looking at all need to change. Right. None of it's the same anymore. And it's really jarring for enterprises who have gotten good at developing software, and they understand the software development lifecycle. They understand startups. There's just so many nuances change. And I think a lot of people look at it and say, I don't understand why this is different, and they start to get annoyed.
Yeah, a lot of people would say the industry's moving too fast. It lacks some sort of operational maturity and experience. How do you land on that? And what are some of the things founders probably don't understand, or maybe some hidden complexity in the whole mix that they
Yeah.
should consider?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that it's necessarily moving too fast, right? I think everybody needs to, I mean, it's going to move as fast as it can move, and it should. I mean,
Yeah.
there's no reason to pump on the brakes here. That's never worked anyway, historically, right? If there's a good groundbreaking technology out there, pumping the brakes here is
Well,
never.
yeah, and I'm not really arguing with you except to say if you're rushing to put in extra pressure on yourself to speed, sometimes you do take those shortcuts and make some
Mhm.
mistakes.
Absolutely. Right. And that's that. So that is a mistake. And I think that, right, what people are rushing through is the ability to backtrack, the ability to troubleshoot, the ability to observe, right? Because they are under pressure to deliver, right? To get to the end state.
Yeah.
Whereas there probably is the end state is probably not known for most generative AI projects right now. And that's fundamentally the dissonance, right? It's like, we're pretty sure we've got a good idea here. We think we know the end state. The end state's in 6 months from now. But guess what? In 6 months from now, everything's going to change.
Is that
So,
really different though than what was the old software industry, where it seems like there's always a rush to hit a date and a production schedule and a rollout and a launch, right?
mhm. Yeah, yeah, it's just customer sentiment and their needs was more stable. So, like, if there was pressure to deliver, you're right. That was always there. Hey, we got to get something into customers' hands in 6 months, right? That's always been something out there, right? Get it into people's hands quickly. Absolutely. You know, what was assumed though, and what was always there, and what's different now is that customer's need didn't materially change between now and 6 months from now. right? How they ran their business did not materially change. Their dependencies didn't materially change, right? And that was one of the reasons why you wanted to get it down to 6 months or a year or whatever, because if you let it go for longer than that, it would change. And then then you really would miss the boat. The cycles within anybody consuming generative AI are much shorter, right? They can be a month, right? Your customer needs and sentiment might change in 1 month, in 4 weeks,
Yeah,
literally.
that's what's
It might
blown me
change in
away
two
in this
weeks.
whole
Yeah.
AI era. Yeah. So, Greg, we talked a little bit earlier about the telemetry problem. You can't improve what you can't see. Let's talk about that for a second. We're doing telemetry wrong. Explain that.
Yeah, yeah, sure. So when we say wrong, I mostly mean that it's too much of an afterthought, right? So we go back to the need to backtrack, the need to troubleshoot, the need to remediate, right? Avoiding, knowing full well you're going to go down a few dead ends, right? Your job, our job, is to backtrack as quickly as possible and get out of it. So I think of it as a backtrack type of exercise. And what people will not do is they won't lay down that breadcrumb trail, right? They'll just say, look, I just got to charge forward and I'm just going to bash through a bunch of doors and I'll get to something and then we'll iterate from there. What they're not doing though is they're not, thinking from the perspective that like, no, there's going to be some doors you can't actually get through. You're going to have to go backwards. You're going to have to understand what your AI system is really doing under the hood, what pieces of it work, what pieces of it don't work. Because if you don't do those things, you're going to end up starting over, right? You're going to end up saying, you know what? Let's switch foundation models. Let's just switch how we do this. Let's move from single agent to multi-agent. These are the things that burn up a lot of time and wreck progress, right? And fundamentally, it's that people are pushing really hard to get to the end, right? And saying, yes, it doesn't have to be perfect. I just need to get there, which was a good approach for traditional software. Like I just need to get the idea into people's hands as quickly as
Yes.
possible. What they're seeing now, though, is that when you're wrong, you can't go back to like an intermediate state because you skipped all of the telemetry, observability, debugging, and et cetera tooling that was part of the thing. So you end up throwing away your whole AI pipeline. You end up saying, all right, well, we made a few, design choices. If we had to do this differently, what would we do? And the answer comes back to, well, we do it over. Like, let's start over. And that's what's wrecking people because not only does that waste time, the developer's time, the engineer's time, but it also erodes confidence from the people that you're working with, whether that be customers or internal stakeholders, right? Because somebody hears that and says, "What? It, but it looks like it's working. What do you mean you're starting over? Like what? This is not what people are used to, right? They're used
Yeah.
to, all right, it needs a new interface. How hard can that possibly be? What is that? Another month, right? I know. Instead, the answers are coming back. No, we built too fast, and Anthropic and OpenAI have done a few things that are different, and now we want to do it as a multi-agent system and not start over. Right? It's just unusual to hear that from people who are coming from software, which ultimately both wastes time as well as erodes confidence, right? And those types of things are very, very detrimental to AI projects.
I mean, we talked a little bit about telemetry. Oh, so maybe we should have you explain it in plain English and why startups, particularly the startup CEO should care about it before they have real enterprise customers.
Yeah, absolutely. So like anything in observability, telemetry, debugging, replay, these are things that engineers do not typically do well by themselves unless they're told to do it. That has always been the case, right? So, right, and that's why as a CTO or an engineering leader, you'd put in metrics, you'd put in guardrails, you'd put in safety, right, to make sure that your operational excellence is up to par, right? Because by default, it won't be, right? By default, people cut corners. By default, people don't do that. They don't really do their P99 latency graphs, right? They don't keep them inspected. They don't, have tickets auto cut. So like the behavior is fundamentally the same. Yeah, it's just that there's not a good because the type of observability that you're looking at doesn't map very well to monitoring host loads, to error rates, to latency or to availability. When I say, okay, team, please go ahead and make sure the system is observable and it's ready. Naturally, what an engineer is going to do is to say, all right, well, I guess that means I just need host latency and a graph, and I guess we'll be okay. And I'll monitor some error rates, right? Those things work fine for traditional software when you have unit tests and all this type of stuff, but there's a whole bunch of non-determinism within, multi-agent systems that exponentially explodes and gets really nasty, as problems. And unless you are explicit with the people building this stuff that, hey, this stuff
Yeah.
is going to bite you, they won't do it, right? And it's just it means that your old run books of how to look after operational excellence don't work anymore. So that's what a CTO needs to do now.
You, along those lines, said that if you can't prove what AI is doing, you're not controlling it.
Mhm.
What do you mean by that? And why is
Yeah, yeah.
AI governance so omnipresent in these discussions?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so our company name Prove can mean many things. Within AI, it could mean improve governance. It could be right. It could also just prove AI works, right? Prove that it's functioning, right? And anything along provability, right? And knowing what your AI system is doing so that you don't have
Yes.
to waste time fixing it is the thing to rally around. So, I mean, it includes governance, but really. It's just a matter of when something breaks. You don't want to have to spend a full day figuring out, did something break? Should I look at something today? And if I'm looking at something, is this a 1 hour problem or is it an 8 hour problem? And if I
Mm,
need to loop in additional people, are we going to spend a day debating about whether or not there is in fact an issue? Because those are the things that will kill you, and those are the things that I see every day, right? And you need some sort of observability trail. You need some sort of suite of troubleshooting systems, right, in order to avoid all of those problems, right? So, the life cycle, right? It's imagine I'm an AI engineer and I have a system, right? I wake up, first thing I want to do that I can't do with today's tooling is answer a simple question like, should I look at something today, right? Because yes, there's evals out there, right? But that's not going to necessarily tell me if there's something I should really be looking at, right? Do I really have enough, visibility into my tool to have it guide me to something to say, hey, is something drifting off the rails in terms of my outcomes, of my AI outcomes, right? Hard problem, but that's something that I'm not given for free. If it is drifting, then what's drifting? Did something change? Does it
right.
correlate with the drift? What's going on here? I don't want to look only at things like model drift and things like that. I want to look more holistically about our outcomes correlated with something. Did something change? Otherwise, I'm going to go on a 5 hour, witch hunt trying to find something that may or may not have changed, and it's going to, waste my day. I'm going to literally, blow my day on it. And the rest, the rest is when I find something. Is this something that I can solve, over morning coffee? Is it something that's going to take the rest of the day? Is it going to be something I need help with? All of like this is one of the biggest kind of shoulder pain moments that we've heard from users out there, and it's nondescript, right? It's almost a meta problem, but it's just the meta problem of I wake up, I want to be building new stuff, but I can't because there's always some vague nondescript outcome that's not going well. And I don't even know if it's a problem yet. And I waste half my day figuring out, is there a problem? And then once I figure out there is a problem, I end up chasing all sorts of crazy things until the end of the day to figure it out because so many people are touching stuff. Um, there's so many possible, problems out there, so many dependencies, and there's non-determinism in the mix. So, recreation of things like replay, the ability to snapshot and replay AI systems doesn't exist for me anywhere. So, like,
Yeah.
when we say prove, that's what we mean by it. It's just like, prove the outcomes, prove that it works, right? Prove what, it can be in anything in this case, right? But there's a whole class of stuff around not really understanding, what's getting you to these outcomes that I want proof over because that'll save me immense amounts of time.
Yeah. There are the coffee morning discussions and problems, and then there's the single malt scotch kinds of discussions that are probably saved better for later at night. When it comes to AI making decisions in regulated industries, that seems like it's one of those kinds of single malt questions. How do you feel about that? And what's the level of comfort and with hallucinations on one side and efficiencies in another? How do you start to look at that as a topic?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm still very bullish on AI everywhere, right? I think it's really up to the individual in the engineer in this case, right?
Hmm.
It becomes their job to put in bulletproof policies and management of their AI systems, right, in order to comply with regulatory stuff, because that's the engineer's job, right? That becomes their new job. So what's a hard problem is how do you describe that to an AI? Because it's not like, we don't get to be hands off and say, well, the AI is going to do what it's going to do. I mean, certainly not, right? It's that it's my job as a professional, as a technology professional,
Yeah.
to manage this non-deterministic system. And right, there's precedent here. There's plenty of other non-deterministic systems out there, right?
Yeah.
And we found ways to manage them in very dangerous things like industrial, applications, as aerospace, et cetera, right? So it's not like this is like, oh my gosh, it's unprecedented. I mean, there's people whose lives are at stake, in response to, systems like geology and various other things that are very unpredictable. So yeah, it just becomes down to the individual to say, do I really understand the regulation well enough? And right, have I spent the legwork really focusing on making my job, to make sure that I understand how to control my AI with sufficient visibility and sufficient force to get the job done that I need to get done, right? The pitfall there is just people, again, taking somewhat hands-off approach, saying, well, I don't know. I mean, it's non-deterministic, so what do you want me to do? I guess I'll get it out there and then we'll see
Yeah.
how it works and then we'll
Right.
react. We'll put out the fire. And that's the bad decision right there, right? That was the wrong decision because it's your job not to worry about getting into production. It's your job to put in those guardrails, to put in the policy, to put in the whatever, right?
Yeah.
To make sure that you never get to that state in the beginning, right? And a lot of people aren't equipped to do that because they've never done it before, right? They've taken a policy as text and they've encoded that into a deterministic system and said, all right, well, we have audits and we have checks and we're sure it will never happen, right? They've never figured out how to instruct an AI and what the right metrics and checks are to make sure that the AI is never going off the rails. They've never done that before, right? Which is the pitfall, right? That's why this problem is existing.
Greg, let me turn our attention just a little bit of futuristic stuff, not that far down the road, but what does the AI stack look like in say 2028 and which layer creates the most enterprise value?
I,
Simple question,
that's
right?
that's an excellent question. I don't know exactly what
Come
28 is going to
on, you
be.
could share.
I can guess, right? I think that what I can guess is that I'll be in the camp who think that models will become more of a commodity, right? Models will commoditize, right? And that you'll end up with a bunch of really interesting engineering tooling out there for code generation as well as for maintenance of those, right? So we have to take things like Claude Code, like yeah. Coding assistance as the de facto, as the norm,
Yeah.
which also implies that people may or may not be making clear-cut technical decisions about what types of AI frameworks are actually being used out there, right? It may be something that's given to them. It may be something that that they leave to the actual coding assistant to suggest and to ultimately run, right? But I think you can assume that the thinking today around there's going to be a choice of models out there, that there's going to be largely commoditized modeling out there is most likely, right? Lots of emphasis on the harness, right? So on creating the tooling and the technology around those models to control, to maintain, and to make sure that they do what you need to do will be fine, right? What that actual stack is probably going to be materially very different than anything that exists today, by
Mm.
2028. I think that that's something to watch. I mean, of course, Codex is of course already going in that direction, right? So, I wouldn't be surprised if they were, somehow playing in the space. Some of the big incumbents out there around model chaining and model observability, I think will still likely be in the mix. Your Lang chains, et cetera. And observability, right? So observability and data telemetry collection, open telemetry and OTel, I think I would make a bet would still be in the picture as well, right? Because I think the need to store a whole host of new sort of telemetry and outputs, right, will be a necessity and won't go away, right? But the day-to-day tooling and how to manage the actual systems and development, I think will probably be stuff by 2028 that may or may not exist today.
Yeah. That's Yeah, that optimization. So the other thing I wanted to do when I have your time, I get a person with your kind of background on the call is to share some of your counsel that you can layer on to some early stage founders, particularly those in this space of, let's just call it AI tech founder. Um, so, what kind of advice do you give first-time founders entering AI right now, and what should they focus on before raising money? Do you mind
Yeah,
sharing some thoughts?
sure, sure. So I have some thoughts, whether they're right or not. I don't know. I no limitation of liability, but I'll try my best
Yeah.
here.
Okay, you're
Um,
absolved.
Thank you. So one is I think that, as a CTO or as a founder, I think building and getting hands-on with this stuff is really important. It's really, I mean, time, right? It takes a lot of time, and I think it's not actually a lack of interest. It's a big time investment, but this is not the time to read a few PowerPoint slides and a few thought leadership and say, hey, I kind of get it. Right. We could pull that type of thing off with a few of the big technology waves in the past. We're like, hey, I get what they're saying. I don't really need to go ahead and do this myself. I don't need to spin up a Kubernetes cluster myself. Um,
Uh-huh.
this is not the case. This is not the time to do that. Right. This is the time where, you know, understand what people are actually, if you were to build something today, what would that look like? Do it yourself, I think is one. You're going to find so many things that are just, you'll get an understanding of what's ready, what's not ready, what things work, what things don't work.
Mm.
Because if you're going to listen to marketing and thought leadership exclusively, you're going to be misled. So I think that that's a key one is to, leaders should be in the details here. They should also, if they're going to manage a team, I think the structure on how they manage early stage prototypes is different as well. So like you've probably heard about token maxing, right? So, people trying to keep an eye on saying, you know what, everybody needs to be a 20x engineer, or whatever we're going to call them. And I'm going to keep track of how many tokens they're consuming for their coding tools. In principle, good idea. In practice, I wouldn't do that. I don't think it's the right, thing. I think it's an easy metric to track, but it's sort of a crutch to, it's sort of a lazy way of doing this, right? I mean, what you're trying to do is to make sure that your engineers are really able to push things out and get feedback quickly, right? So like, what I prefer, specifically is to, instead of spinning up like, the Amazon two pizza team, right? So, right, don't do that anymore, right? So I don't think that that's necessary anymore because, right, one person should be able to deliver a prototype in a few weeks. So like that becomes the expectation, and the metric then becomes, well, are they passing through gates as I would expect, right? Are they hitting a 3 to 4 week prototype timeline? Are they iterating? Are they getting into people's hands for something that they could look at? Are they getting feedback? And are they, putting out something materially different? Um, right. So, I mean, that implies that they're going to be consuming a lot of tokens anyway, right? Because it's one person, it's one person. It's not a team of people. You know exactly what they're doing, and you know that they're actually outputting working software. So I think what I'm advocating here for an early stage is like, don't spin up a team, right? It's spin up a research lab in many ways, right? Expect people to put out prototypes of their own, right? Expect people to start prototyping, and expect them to, expect each engineer to be responsible for a full end-to-end, idea. I'm sure that's there's going to be times when maybe you want 2 or 3 or 4 people on, and of course, as you get some traction and you figure out what you want to do, yeah, having one person do everything is not going to be the way forward. But the biggest pitfall is just, hey, we're going to do an AI project. Let's figure out the customer pain. Now let's throw 10 people on it and let's get started. It doesn't work very well because you don't get your first prototype in 2 weeks, which is what you'd want, right? You get a bunch of planning, you get a bunch of back and forth, you get a bunch of discussion. It stalls things. You don't want to do that, right? You want, at the very beginning, you actually want a bunch of stuff that you're going to throw away. You want to tease out the idea, you want to show it to people, and then you can start consolidating. It's very different than how you would approach traditional software, right? The Amazon, the famous PRFAQ process in the two pizza team, right? That I'm familiar with, and it does work very well for launching, startups within an enterprise at scale. It doesn't work very well here, right? You're almost going back to a different way of working. And that's probably the biggest material advice I would give to a startup CTO, right? One is go deep, figure out what you need to be great at in a technical, be hands-on about it, right? If you're going to read marketing, you're not going to get there. And then when it comes time to spinning up a team, do not throw 10 people on it. Do not throw 5 people on it. They're going to step all over each other and they're going to get nothing done for 3 weeks. Like really, you're going to have to cut it down to one person, get me a prototype in this number of weeks, consolidate from there and build. It's very mind jarring in the beginning because it goes against all traditional wisdom that I think most CTOs have relied on for the past couple of decades.
Yeah. Um, Greg, I've got a bunch more questions for you, but if you don't mind, I'm going to jump over to the lightning round just to kind of
Sure.
change the pace a little bit. And these are short answers, but I won't stop you. So we as a technology industry, love jargon. What's the most overhyped AI term today?
Hmm, that's a good question. Yeah, I think it's still agentic, agentic AI, right? It's one of those terms that could mean too many things, right? There's a lot of that in here. I'll pick on that one just because when we say it, do we mean it's a multi-agent system? If it is multi-agent, what are we talking like? What is the agent? Do we mean multi-foundation model or what? So I'll pick that one. But
That's a good one. What's the most underrated founder skill?
oh, uh, I'd have to go with here. Yeah, the ability to ignore things, right? So a lot of good founders and a lot of great founders, right?
Yeah,
Are the really, and this could be myself as well, right? You're not good at everything. In fact, there's a lot of things that I'm not good at. There's a lot of good things that some really fantastic founders are terrible at. And but what they are is they're fantastic at like two things. And right, one of their key skills is learning to ignore stuff, right? It's just like it doesn't matter, right? All I need to do is this. All I need to do is this. And concentrating on that one thing it's just a very underrated founder skill. Founders who get distracted and want to be master of everything and right, who get caught off guard and get upset when they, get a question like, oh, well, have you heard of this other startup that just came out? Right. If they get distracted by that, it's actually a very bad thing, especially in AI, because every other day there's going to be something else that you haven't heard of. And
yeah,
at some point you're just like, it's not my priority right now. And being comfortable with that and able to do that is a very underrated skill.
yeah. It's like prioritization,
Yeah,
specialization, leading
ruthless
the team.
prioritization.
I like that. One startup mistake founders repeat endlessly.
Mm. Yeah, so yeah, it's fundamentally, pivot, right? Pivot quickly. I think
Yeah.
yeah, I think if you had to ask this question a little while ago, even before AI, that would still be an answer, right? But I think it just means in this case, it just becomes the pivot needs to be happening even earlier in the cycle, right? So it's still something that people miss out on. You can even see that with a lot of the AI tools that are out there, right? So
Mm,
some that are widely loved, widely used, but for some reason, don't have that big gigantic valuation or the ability to transact, right? There's a lot of odd transactions out there.
yes.
And right, fundamentally they made a bunch of them have great products, maybe open source, maybe free open source, right? But a bunch of design decisions early on about are we going to commit to single agent systems? Like, is every AI going to be like a chatbot and have a human operator in the mix, right? Some of those big assumptions that some really big AI properties made early on and turned out to be false 2 years later, right? I look at them and I say, I'm sure they know. I'm sure I'm not teaching them anything here, but you kind of get yourself into a sticky situation there because the market has moved on and right the signal was probably there. Yeah, it's just again that ruthless pivoting and expecting people to change is one of the biggest pitfalls that's out there.
Okay, I'll put you on the spot and ask you for an AI company that you really admire. Like they just
Hmm.
keep nailing it or keep doing really cool stuff or breaking the mold and doing it repeatedly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I particularly, I like a lot of the stuff that's coming out of Codex at the moment, right? So, um, you know, I look at it's also especially relevant, again, this pivot thing, right? And the existential pivot that they had, right? And that where they were, that they were closely bound to, some particular AI providers, right? Some model providers, right? And just, really, really, a willingness to stay close to their customer base, right? Frank and open discussion around, hey, yes, there's trouble. Here's what we're doing. An ability to release under those conditions is really hard, right? So, yeah, what I'm respecting here is just, people who, are able to see something coming, right? And say, didn't expect this to happen. I think in their words, if I'm remembering one of their code releases, right, it's code red. It's we're in trouble. We're still going to do this, right? So the communication, the clarity of communication, the ability to keep releasing, right, keep a team, delivering under those conditions is extremely hard, right? And th those things together, like no concern around making a really hard pivot, a really hard turn, anyway, right? Quickly being able to craft, like, what are we going to do about it? And then turn your team in that direction and continue executing is immensely hard. And, I'll throw that one out there that I was, particularly impressed with how that went.
Good one, Greg. And then for final question, what should founders spend less time on or more time on? I know we danced around this in a couple ways, but I'm
Mhm.
re-asking the question. Maybe you could put a finer point on something.
Yeah, sure. So I think the founders, I think I talked about what they should spend more time on, which is going deep, right? On the spend less time on, I see diminishing returns from spending too much time on, future vision and thinking, those 2 to 3 year outs type of situations, just because so many of the predictions are wrong at the moment, right? So trying to design and think about, oh my gosh, well, what would happen if Anthropic did thing X, or oh my gosh, what would happen if Google decided to get into this space, right? There's like 1,000 what ifs out there
Yeah.
that it's just a waste of time. You don't know what any of them are going to do, and no line of reasoning can predict their behavior right now. And right now, there's still a lot of founders out there who think that way, right? Who think like I know exactly what Google's going to do with Gemini, and well, logically, Anthropic would do this, and then they would do this, and then Microsoft would jump in and do, like, I've heard this line of reasoning from at least 2 or 3 people, and it's like, they're going to be there ready to bounce when ready to pounce with their product when all of these big players do exactly as they think they will. It's just I don't think that that's a good idea, right? And I think that that thought exercise is a waste of time right now.
That makes sense to me. Well, this has been a master class from somebody who has actually been there, done that. I uh I think it's been fantastic, Greg. Whalen, prove AI off to the races with your own company, and thanks for sharing some thoughts with us as well here. Any last comment before we send you back to the pits?
Yeah, sure, sure. Just check us out at proofai.com. We also have a multi-agent systems engineering group on Discord. We're always happy to have people come and chip in on, like, what types of debugging and, you know, provability challenges are you having, right? We're actively building a community out there to talk about it. So, yep, check us out there. Multi-agent systems engineering group on Discord or proofai.com.
Greg, that's fantastic. In the time in the fun era that we're in right now, it's extremely challenging, and I think community is a great way to kind of help lift all boats. So thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.